Hello, hello, hello. This is Helen Thomas and the CDFM Study Group. Welcome. All right. Brand new video, brand new study guide. And so I'm going to begin review of CDFM Module 1, Competency 1 from the Government Resource Management Environment Participant Guides for Management Concepts. And so what I've done is incorporated some of the newer information from this study guide and the older study guides. I'll be uploading the video to YouTube. So if you're either participating live or you'll be able to watch the video later on YouTube. Please be sure to subscribe to our YouTube page so that the platform will then advertise our YouTube channel and the CDFM videos will be able to get out to individuals that are trying to study. There will be notes for this session, and the link to the notes will be provided in the description of the video once I upload it later. All right, let's drive right on into the information. All right, so government RM environment. The topic is exactly the same as the older study guides. Let's start there. So yes, you might be able to use the older study guides and still pass the exam. The management concept has it set up where you have to take their training to get a copy of the electronic study guides. They do not mail out hard copy study guides like they did, like the ASMC did in the past. Now everything is electronic. All right, so let's start lesson 1 with the legislative process. You got to understand how the laws are impact what we do and the processes that we do. To be successful on the CDFM, you must be able to understand the key players involved, the documents they produce, the processes, and when these processes occur. That is the key to success. All right, so some of the key documents that generates the way we do our legislative process began with the Declaration of Independence in 1776. Then the Articles of Confederation was ratified in 1781. The U.S. Constitution ratified by 9 states in 1788. And the U.S. Constitution took effect March 4th, 1789. So understand the order in which they occur, even if you don't remember the month in which they occurred. Sorry about that. So the Articles of Confederation is the precursor, the starting point for the Constitution. So ultimately, everything that we do within the federal government began with the U.S. Constitution. And so the U.S. Constitution is the ultimate law of the land. 9 times out of 10, if we're trying to do something in the government, we will go to the Constitution to see what the Constitution says we can or cannot do on that topic. And so the legislative process starts when a bill is first introduced. That's the general proposal of the law that we want to put in place. And it ends when it's signed by the president and it becomes law. So the Constitution kind of allows for the distribution of power, equal distribution in the sense of that separation of power, and the power is shared between the 50 states and the federal government, in that we are able to vote. And so the principles of separation of power resulted in these 3 branches of government, right? You want to learn them in this order: legislative branch, executive, and judicial. And the purpose for learning them in that order is to understand that based on the Constitution, Article 1 governs the legislative branch, Article 2, the executive, and Article 3, the judicial branch. And so if you learn legislative, executive, judicial, you know it's Article 1, Article 2, Article 3. Understand some basics. that the legislative branch is another name for Congress, the executive branch, another name for the president, and the judicial branch is the Supreme Court or some other inferior court. So the courts are involved. So that's some basic knowledge there. So I'm kind of laying out the plan so that you're able to comprehend and understand where things lie, who sits where, because it's going to become important to remember this as we move along. All right, so as I mentioned, legislative branch is the first branch of government. Their job is to make the laws. Legislative begins with an L, laws, make laws. And so under Article 1, it says that of the Constitution, it governs the actions of the legislative branch to make the laws. Article 1, Section 1 says that Congress must have two bodies. It's made up of the Senate and the House of Representatives, two bodies. Then Article 1, Section 2 goes on to say the House of Representatives, they will serve 2-year terms, and electors in each state are selected based on the most numerous branch of the state. And so depending on however many personnel are in that state will determine the number of representatives they have in the House of Representatives. Okay, so 8 House of Representatives serve 2-year terms. And Article 1, Section 3 says every state will have 2 senators, regardless of the size of the state, they will have 2 senators. Senators serve 6-year terms. Each have 1 vote. And the Vice President of the United States serves as the President of the Senate. So a lot of people don't really know that. So we're going to make sure I point that out. So again, every state, so there are 50 states, they all have 2 senators. So that's 100 senators. And the Vice President of the United States is the President of the Senate. Next one, Article 1, Section 7 says the House of Representatives are the ones that will submit bills to raise revenue, to raise money. It'll be generated from the House of Representatives. And it also states in Section 7 that 2/3 vote of Congress can override a presidential veto. So if the president does not want to put something in law, he vetoes it, sends it back. If 2/3 of the Congress, remember both sides have to come together, if they can vote and agree, 2/3 vote or more, they can override whatever the president says. So if the president does not return a bill within 10 days and Congress is in session, do you know that that bill also automatically becomes law? And so those are some of the things we're going to talk about presidential action. There's some instances where the president refuses to sign a bill and that bill can still become law if he doesn't return it. Under Article 1, Section 8, it allows the Congress to raise taxes, borrow money, declare war. So if you notice, the majority of the functions of the government falls with our Congress, not the president. The president's power is very limited. Even though they are the face of the country, their power is very limited. And so when it comes to voting, it's essential that you vote the right people in your Congress, not necessarily your president, even though we focus a lot on that. Article 1, Section 8, again, also says that we can raise armies, provide and maintain a navy. And if you don't remember none of these articles that I went over, the most important one to every financial manager is Article 1, Section 9, because it states no money can be drawn from the Treasury Department unless, that's our nation's bank, you can't get any money out of the bank unless we have an appropriation law in place. That's not the legal way to say it, but that's the simplified version to help you to understand better. So Article 1, Section 9, and it's actually Clause 7. It goes into it. But no money can be drawn from the Treasury. So if you're doing a multiple choice exam and it starts off under Article 1, Section 9, this branch of government will shut down if no appropriation law is in place, or a temporary appropriation law, such as the continuing resolution. Then that will be the legislative branch, because Article 1 is the trigger that tells you it's the legislative branch that makes the laws. The next branch of government is the president. Power is very limited. The president serves 4-year terms. The president or the executive branch executes the laws. So whatever laws Congress makes, the executive branch executes. See, the E starts with executive. They execute the laws, right? And so the powers is to execute the law is the president. Then Article 2, Section 2 says that the president is the commander in chief. There's a couple of other things the president can do. Appoint ambassadors. Ambassadors are representative of the president in different countries. The president can appoint judges, which we've seen. The president can make treaties with 2/3 Senate vote. And also the president has the power to grant pardons, let people out of jail. That's about it. Commander-in-chief of the military, and so forth. Article 3 are the courts. They interpret the laws, and that is your Supreme Court or lower courts. And they have the power to say something is constitutional or non-constitutional. As I stated earlier, the Constitution is the law of the land. That's our textbook, our standard operating procedure of where we go to get things done. So they can conduct judicial review, hear cases under federal law. They can enforce the Constitution and federal law review and interpret those laws. Congress, as stated earlier, is divided in two bodies, two sections. You have the House of Representatives and the Senate, and we went over that shortly. They have equal power, even though their terms and size are different. Because as I stated, the House of Representatives, they serve 2-year terms, senators, 6-year terms. House of Representatives, plenty of them, because it's based on the size of the state, depending, will determine how many House of Representatives you have. Senators, 2 per state, don't matter size, completely different. So how many House of Representatives do we have? Voting members, you have 435 or 35 voting members in the House of Representatives. So the number is based on the state's population. In the Senate, if it's 50 states and you got 2 per state, you have 100 Senate members that serve these 6-year terms. A key here, because the House of Representatives represent their districts, their states, the number of people, all bills to raise money, to raise revenue, is initiated in the House of Representatives. So each election cycle is when they elect a new Congress will come in place. So since the entire House of Representatives is up for election every 2 years. Please note, the U.S. territories such as Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, that's where I'm from, so you'll hear a little accent. I'm from the U.S. Virgin Islands. In the U.S. Virgin Islands, in Puerto Rico and the District of Washington, D.C., they do not have voting representative in Congress. They can participate in the political process by electing a delegate to be in the House of Representatives, but they do not have a representative in the House of Representatives, and they do not have any senators. So important to note. Next, congressional committees. There are 3 types, 3 basic types of congressional committees, and there will be a 4th, but the main 3 types are Standing members. Anytime in the CDFM you hear the word standing, it just means I'm not moving, I'm permanent. So these are permanent committee members. So standing, special, and joint. Special, they just created for a particular purpose. Joint, they have representative from different sections. So standing, special, joint. But I will tell you there's also a fourth committee that is typically used, and it's called the conference committee or the third chamber. That particular type of committee only comes together when the House and the Senate differ in their perspective of a bill. If they're, remember, only one bill can go to the president to sign to become law. So even though the same process happens on the House and the Senate, and they're looking at the same document, they have to then come together to resolve any differences. Whenever the House and the Senate come together to resolve differences in the bill, it is called a conference committee or a third chamber. So understand that there are 20 standing committees in the House of Representatives and 16 standing, that's the main ones, in the Senate. Now, how do we propose legislation? How do we get something to be a law? There's a process for that, and you got to understand the process. But first, let's go over some basic definition. What is a bill? Because that is what you have to turn in to it to start the legislative process. As I said, it starts with submitting a bill. So a bill is just a general proposal of whatever you want to become law. And there's only certain people can submit these bills. So the House of Representatives, when they get a bill, they number it with an H and a R and the number of the bill. Senate puts the S on it and the number, the same number on it. Understand that bills must go to the president for the president to sign for it to become law. Then similar to a bill, you have something that's called a joint resolution process. In the joint resolution, it is similar to a bill. The House joint resolution and the Senate, they just put a H and a J, RES, for resolution. So those particular bills, joint resolution, both of those go to the president for the president to sign for them to become law. The joint resolution process used to consider proposed changes to the Constitution. So you might say, if the joint resolution is similar to a bill, why would I need to do a joint resolution? So typically, if they want to propose any changes to the Constitution itself, the law of the land, then they use the joint resolution process. A key thing here in that joint resolution is a ratification or change to the Constitution. Before you can even submit it to the president, it must be approved by 3/4 of the states. So a proposed amendment is never sent to the president for approval. So if they can agree 3/4 of it, and if 3/4 of the states don't agree that the Constitution needs to be changed, then nothing is done. But if more than them and they all agree, then it sends forward for the president to sign. Another term, concurrent resolution and simple resolution. So these are just processes that we use. Concurrent means the same action is happening on the House and the Senate side. Simple resolution is either or. Neither concurrent or simple processes go to the president for signature. These are not laws. These are the way in which Congress operates, processes. All right, so there's only 3 areas in which you can originate or start a legislation process. It's either recommended by the president himself or herself, because one day we will have a her. It's introduced by members of Congress, so an individual member can recommend, and also it's introduced by a committee, so the committee itself. And so let's talk about the recommendation by the president, because Congress you can understand, but the president has several subtle ways in which they introduce and tell Congress what their priorities are. The primary way in which the president informs Congress of a legislation they're going to want to push in place is the State of the Union address. And that is where the president will often recommend their considerations. What's priority to them? What are the kind of things that they want to see come out as a law? So he makes proposal in the annual budget. So if you see a lot of times when it's time for the annual budget, it's kind of like a bargaining tool in the sense. It's not just, hey, we need to keep the government open, but it's used often as a bargaining tool. Like, hey, if you want funding for this, give me funding for that. Quid pro, right? So you can personally address a joint session if he wants to, or sending a message to Congress. And so the three ways again in which you can originate a legislation where they can submit a bill: president, members, or committees. So how does a bill become law? The actual process. Let's talk about the steps. Once you submit the bill, so let's say the member submitted a bill, then it is placed in a hopper. That's HOPPER, the hopper. So just kind of imagine if you're writing a book. The first time you write a book and you give it to someone, it's probably going to be some errors in it, right? So you first give it to the individual, it's placed in the hopper, and then it's considered. So in Congress, you have consideration by the committee. Depending on whatever the topic is, if it's dealing with agriculture, if it's dealing with state, if it's dealing with defense, then those committees will be the ones that's looking over the documents. Public hearings, they allow an opportunity for the agency to come in and justify, explain, tell me, why do you want this bill? And then you have a markup session. So the markup session is simply, yeah, we disagree with this portion of it. So, and we agree with this portion. So the markup session is after the hearings are completed, the bill is now called the markup session. Then the committee, once you fix it, the committee will take action. So you'll go back, you fix the report, clean it up, and it's called a clean bill once you make the adjustments that were stated earlier. A new term that I notice in the newer books is cloture occurs in the Senate. CLOTURE, cloture. It occurs in the Senate, and that is a term used to end a debate and take a vote. So if they're on the floor and they're having a debate over a topic, at some point you have to end that debate. And that term is cloture. CLOTURE. Moving in the process, and the House and the Senate will now, once they clean the bill, they finish their debate, both the House and the Senate will be looking at the same bill. Each side reviews the bill in identical form, and then they make a vote. Once the bill passes one or the other, the House or the Senate, that bill is now called an engrossed bill. And as I mentioned when we started, in order to resolve differences, because even though they're doing it on both the House floor and the Senate floor, is they have to come together to resolve differences. All right, sorry for that pause. Emergency. All right, so resolving the differences in the third chamber, the House and the Senate does not provide an advantage. So even if when they come together in the conference and the House might say, all right, we need to send 10 people, and then the Senate will send 2 people, they do not have an advantage because they're voting as one unit. The House of Representatives, the Senate, period. And then finally, once everything's cleaned up, they've resolved their differences, they agree, that final step is that bill is then enrolled and submitted to the president for signature to become law. So then once it gets to the president, what options does the president have? Under Article 1, Congress, legislative branch, Section 7, Clause 2 of the Constitution, it says that if the president does not return a bill within 10 days, Sundays not included, and Congress is in session, that bill will automatically become law. So the functions of the president, what he can do when he gets a bill, is dictated in Article 1, Section 7. All right, so let's see. When the president gets the bill, okay, it's the bill on military construction. All right, he can either approve it and sign it, it becomes law. He can veto. Veto means to send it back. If there are portions of the bill that the president does not agree with, the president has to return the entire bill back to the originator, whoever originated it. And remember, I stated earlier, if 2/3 of Congress can agree that they don't like the veto, they can override a presidential veto. Now, it was key in pointing out that with the veto, that the entire bill goes back because in 1996, President Clinton at the time, he was allowed to use the line item veto process. What does that mean? Line item veto meant that President Clinton, while he's reviewing a bill, if he did not like a portion of the bill, he was allowed to line through it, sign the bill, and the rest of the bill became law. In 1998, the courts, the judicial branch, deemed that that action is unconstitutional. You can't mark out what you don't like, make it law. And so now they go strictly veto. If you don't like a portion of it, you have to send the entire bill back. So option 1, approve and sign, becomes law. Veto, return it. There are 2 other options. There's a pocket veto and does not sign it, but it still becomes law. So a pocket veto here is the president receives the bill, does not sign it within 10 days, Congress is not in session, that bill will not become law. It's called a pocket veto. So as long as Congress is adjourned and not in session and he receives a bill, do nothing within 10 days, it will not become law. The key comes where it does not sign it and it still becomes law when Congress is in session. The president receives the bill, doesn't return it within 10 days, that bill will automatically become law. So key to remember there are the differences. Pocket veto, veto, approve and sign, does not sign, but allows the bill to become law. So understand that some bills, some laws are permanent and some are temporary. They might say, for this particular period of time, you can't purchase this equipment. Or the words in this and succeeding acts or hereafter, meaning it's not just for now, it's for the future. So words of futurity, meaning the legislation is not just for now, it's for the future periods of time. There are a few laws that you must be familiar with because They are the reason we have certain organizations and agencies in the government. The first one is the 1921 Budget and Accounting Act. The Budget and Accounting Act is the reason that the president must submit the budget to Congress every year, annually. It established the Office of Management and Budget. That is the resource manager or CFO for the president. OMB works for the president. Then you also have the Government Accountability Office was created from that 1921 Act. The GAO is an independent auditing agency that works for Congress. So you got Congress, your president, your courts. Congress has the GAO to oversee the execution of the funds. The Office of Management and Budget is the one that develops the president's budget, the PresBud. So 1921 Budget and Accounting Act. Then you have the 1974 Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act. There's a couple of things that came out of that. It established the House and Senate Budget Committee, and you'll see here we talk about those shortly. It established the CBO, Congressional Budget Office. So Congress has their own budget office. So Congress has GAO and they have a budget office. It says that funding is not available until it's apportioned by OMB. So a portion is just a distribution of the funds. So you hear that Congress appropriates the funds, OMB apportions funds, and DOD issues allotments. So you got to know those three words, and we'll talk about in depth later. And it requires the president to submit to Congress the budget, that annual budget we talked about from 1921. It must be submitted no later than the first Monday in February of that year. All of that came out of the 1974 law. And then you have the 1990 Chief Financial Officers Act, says we must have auditability, established chief financial officers, oversight of our financial systems. All of that came out of the 1990 CFO Act. Let's see what else. Okay, so the next lesson, it moves into fiscal law. So this particular competency we're going over today accounts for the majority of the questions on the exam. It's 35%. So everything is kind of evenly distributed, but this one has most of the questions on the exam. So fiscal law, there's nothing new here. You know a lot of this already, so rely on your knowledge. So everything in fiscal law is based on the Constitution. So most of your common laws are annual authorizations and appropriations law, if we want to put something in that common and annually. We already talked about Article 1, Section 7, raising revenue, overriding presidential veto, returning the bill. Article 1, Section 8, we talk about Congress can raise revenue, borrow money, raise taxes. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7, no money can be drawn from the Treasury. So all of that is a repeat. So let me go now to different types of appropriations. Some of the appropriation we use are specific: military construction, aircraft, missile, ships, research and development. And then you have your general appropriation, which is often the operation and maintenance, your O&M. So if you will notice, for those who, if you want to test this out, Congress provides specific appropriations for specific purposes. However, they put the details of those appropriations in a committee report. They do not put it in the appropriation law. And the reason they don't is they want to make sure that if they want to change something in that process, or they want to hold some funding back, that it's not a law that they have to give you all that funding. So DOD often will get what they get, what the agencies get is a lump sum. Even though you know it's broken down in categories, you get when you get the appropriation, it says you got $5 billion. And then the side documents, the supporting documents, the committee reports will say, okay, you have O&M, MILPER, it'll break it down later for the thresholds. So different types of authorizations, different types of appropriations. Committee reports role in controlling the agency. So what I was talking about, this is a process that Congress uses additional to control the agencies. So that's why they don't include the committee reports with the appropriations or the authorization law that we're going to talk about. So the principles of fiscal law, we all should know: purpose, time, and amount. Purpose is governed under 31 U.S. Code 1301, amount 1502. No, time 1502, amount 1341, 1342, and 1517. So when you look at purpose and you're trying to figure out the right appropriation to do and fulfill that requirement, you have to apply the necessary expense doctrine, where you say, is whatever I'm trying to do logically related to the appropriation that I'm trying to use? You say, is it prohibited by law? Or can it be paid for in a different way? Is it already supplied in the supply process? Army Depot, does the Army Depot provide that resource? And I'm over here trying to do a new contract for it. So you have to think of all these things. So that is called the necessary expense doctrine. In the purpose of use of appropriation, remember you have specific and general. So there's some thresholds that will say, even for a specific, that you can use a general appropriations for. Here's what I'm talking about. If you have a procurement of a system and it costs less than $250,000 and you don't have any procurement funds, you don't have to get procurement funds. You can use O&M funding, operations and maintenance funding, to procure that system that's less than $250,000. If that procurement of that item costs more than $250,000, then you need procurement dollars. Likewise, and I think the threshold is going to be increased to like 350, but don't quote me on that. So I'm going to just go with what's in the book for now. Also, typically, if you're doing a construction project, you need military construction dollars. However, if you have a construction and it's less, I think, than 2 million, then you can use O&M dollars, which is general, instead of a specific military construction. So know those two thresholds. Fiscal law, let's move on to time. 31 U.S. Code 1502. That anti-deficiency, meaning you can't violate the timeline. Every appropriation has a specific timeline in which you can enter into new contracts. You can obligate those funds. So in the timeline, you have to look at the bona fide needs rule. That's a term associated with time. Bona fide needs just basically says, I have current funds for current requirements. But as you know, with everything, there's always an exception. And we need to know, when can I obligate? Can I use current funds to make this purchase for an item that I need in October? Is it legal? So those are the types. So you look at the bona fide needs, and that you typically will use current funds to meet current needs. So first you have to understand the appropriation life cycle. Every appropriation is current, available for a specific time. And we're going to go over the different appropriations. Then after that time is up, all appropriations enter into the expired state. And they stay in the expired state for an additional 5 years. And then after that 5th year, they are closed and canceled. So for this particular video, we are working on closing out fiscal year 20. So we're still dealing with FY20. So once that FY20, that 5th year ends, it'll be closed 1 October of this year, which is 2025. And what happens to those funds when it enters the closed state? What happens to the funds when the appropriation is in the expired state? So let's go down the list. If it's current and available, that means I can enter into new obligations or new contracts. When the fund enters the expired state, that extra 5 years, the only thing you can do is make upward or downward adjustments. That means I already had a contract in place, but now in this expired state, they need to return some funds. They need to request additional funding, whatever it is, because things change and things cost more now. And it's in the expired state, but you have to have already a valid contract before it enters the expired state. And then once it crosses over into the closed or canceled state, those funds are then removed from our accountability and it is returned to the Treasury Department, our nation's bank, and it is placed in the miscellaneous receipts account in that Treasury. However, there's always an exception to policy, which states if you receive an invoice, let's say 1 October, I receive an invoice for a canceled account, I can use up to 1% of current appropriation that matches the same appropriation back then, but I can use up to 1% of current appropriation to pay for that invoice on that canceled account. I cannot use, so if I'm in the expired state, I cannot use current funds to pay for transaction on an expired bill. That makes sense. Meaning I can't use my current appropriation to pay for an FY20 bill. I have to have FY20 funds to do so. The two largest types of appropriations are your O&M and your MILPERS, military personnel paid account. Those are your two largest appropriations. The major multi-year appropriations that we deal with. So multi-year. So O&M and MILPERS are 1 year annual expense type appropriation. Your multi-year are RDT&E, which is a 2-year appropriation. Procurement is a 3-year appropriation. And then you have your shipbuilding conversion Navy is a procurement, but it's a 5-year appropriation. It's going to take you about 5 years to build that ship, right? And military construction is also a multi-year investment, and it's a 5-year appropriation. That knowledge is essential for you because the way you will see it on the exam, they're not going to ask you, it's a certification exam. They're not going to ask you, well, RDT&E is how many years is it available? 2 years. Procurement, 3 years. No. Oftentimes you will get a question like this, and I'll try to do it a couple of times. If today is 2 November 2005, you just received procurement funds. When will these funds be closed? And the question is closed. So I repeat, if today is 21 November 2005, you just received procurement funds, when will these funds be closed? So that is how you're going to use that knowledge of the life cycle of that appropriation. So you're going to say, first of all, you need to know what fiscal year you're in. If it's 2 November 2005, you are in fiscal year 2006. What type of funds do we have? We have procurement funds. And we said pure procurement funds are available for 3 years. So that means FY 6, 7, and 8, it is available. Then we also said that every appropriation goes in the expired state for an additional 5 years. So it is expired fiscal year 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13, which means it will be closed FY 14 for that example. So if you see it on an exam, that is probably the way you're going to see it. I don't see the exams, so I can't tell you for sure. But if it's a certification exam, it's not going to ask you, O&M is a 1-year appropriation, MILPERS 1 year. No, it's going to tell you and give you a scenario. So I'll repeat this example one more time, and then I'll move on. If today is 2 November or November the 2nd, 2005, and you just received procurement funds, when will these funds be closed? First, you need to know what fiscal year you're in. If it's November the 2nd, 2005, you are in fiscal year 2006. Procurement funds are available. They're good for new contracts for 3 years. So that means fiscal year 6, 7, and 8, they are available. Then the next stage is expiration. Every appropriation stays expired for an additional 5 years. So that's fiscal year 9 through 13 that is expired. And then it will be closed. So the answer to your question on that exam will be, it's closed fiscal year 14, if you're asked a question like that. All right, so now let's look at when to obligate and how much you can obligate and so forth by looking at 2 types of contracts, a severable contract versus a non-severable. A severable contract means I can end that contract and I still would have received a benefit from that contract. An example of a severable service is cleaning. We have individuals, actually they're there today, so I don't know if you can hear the vacuums. Cleaning contract. They come in every week and they vacuum, they clean. If I want to end the contract early, I still would have received those previous cleaning services. So I still got a benefit. Grass cutting, maintenance, security. A non-severable contract or a non-severable service is an undertaking, is a function that once I start that job, I have to complete the entire job in order for me to get a benefit. So oftentimes on a non-severable, they will obligate the full amount of the contract because I can't give you portions of it. They'll obligate the full amount up front. That projects such as software equipment repair, I can't half repair it in the contract and still get a benefit. I need you to complete the entire repair. Training is a non-severable because if oftentimes when you go to a training, they have a schedule of different things you have to train on in order for you to get that certificate and says you're good to go. And so if you leave the class early, then you don't get that certificate because it's incomplete. So there are some, remember earlier we talked about bona fide needs rule, current year funds, current needs. Well, when you come with severable, you have to look at, this is the general rule. If you have a cleaning service, severable service, and it's 12 months or less, you will obligate the full amount of the contract with current funds. Let's say the period of performance on that contract starts 1 September and it runs over the next fiscal year. You will still use the current fiscal year funding to obligate that 12-month contract. If the contract says it's a 13-month contract, you can only obligate up to 12 months of current funds. And then for that additional month, you can state, and the contractor, the KO, will say, subject to availability of funds for that option year, that 13th month. Excuse me. Some exceptions to the bona fide need rule says if I have supplies and inventory that I need early in October, I can purchase, I think it says purchases on 170 days inventory to replace used inventory. Purchasing of supplies that will be consumed in the first quarter. Items that have a long lead time. That means if I want to have some new Humvees by December and it takes them 5 months to create it and develop it, I can't wait till December or the next fiscal year in October to do it. I'm going to have to do it earlier on so current funds, to even though it's crossing over fiscal year. So there are exceptions to the bona fide needs rule, depending on what the requirements are. So all that dealing with time. And then the third part is amount, purpose, time, and amount. And so amount says I can't spend more than what I receive. I can't spend it before I get it, all of those things. And so in the amount, and I pulled this in from the other older study guides because it wasn't in the newer ones as clearly, is 31 U.S. Code 1541 says I cannot spend in excess or before I receive appropriation. And 1517 says I cannot spend in excess or before I receive apportionment. It'll be clear to you why I point those out. So if it says, they give you a scenario and they said, is this person violating violating 1341, 1541, 1517? What are they violating? I think that's 1341, 42. I just saw something wrong here. Okay, and cannot spend before you receive those. So when we go over funding flow from how it starts from Congress and trickle down, you'll see appropriation comes first, then apportionment, then allotment. So if it says I violated apportionment, that means I would have received apportionment. So the agencies receive apportionment from OMB. So we'll go over that. All right, so in the budget process, let's kind of switch gears a little bit. Federal budget process starts with budget formulation, budget, congressional actions, and execution. So in formulation is simply when the budget is being formulated by OMB via information is sent out on OMB Circular A11, and they give us guidance, and then the agencies will begin that process. So those are terms: revenue, spending. Okay, yeah, I want to go over this particular piece because it's not done. All right, so OMB Circular A11 provides formulation guidance. The agencies develop their budget draft, they submit it, and they go over it. During the fall review, they go over it with OMB. OMB does and give their recommendation, do their own markup. And when OMB completes the budget process based on whatever they sit down with the different agencies, the document that is sent up to the president is called the OMB passback. That's the approved budget that they're submitting to the president for the president to sign and submit, actually not sign, but to approve. And before they can submit it, no later than the first Monday in February to Congress. There are revolving funds also. We mostly talk about appropriated funds, but revolving funds are those no-year appropriation. They have like an X, they don't expire. They still have rules in which they have to follow. But the most important no-year revolving fund that is often talked about is the DoD Defense Working Capital Fund. And I'll give you a quick example of the working capital fund, like your commissaries or working capital, meaning they take, it's just like the civilian side, and there's only one big difference. They take their funding, they buy the food item, put it on the shelf, and based on how much it costs them to put the food item on the shelf, they put a price on it to charge the customer. Customer comes in, pays that price, the money revolves back in. So it's the same thing like the civilian. The only difference between the civilian and the commercial side, the goal of the commercial side is to make a profit. So they base their price off of making a profit. But the goal of a revolving fund is to break even. So you can notice sometimes when you go to the commissary, and I think they have to put their prices like an annual. I'm not sure, though, don't quote me on that one. But if they consistently show a profit in the revolving fund, that means they have to lower prices on those items the next year. So they have to keep an eye on that. So you'll see the prices go up sometimes, and sometimes it'll be significantly cheaper than the commercial side, because that means they've made a profit in the last year or so. And so now they have to lower the cost of that item. All right, so let's talk about how the government makes money and the bills that the government has to pay. So revenue and expenses. The number one ways in which the federal government makes money is through your individual income taxes, for those of us that pay tax. So oftentimes you're going to hear that, hey, we need to raise taxes. And they try to stay away from it, but that's the number one way they make money. The next group is it's still the same thing, because they're taking Social Security and Medicare out of our check. So we pay tax and we pay Social Security and Medicare. So it seems like we're actually paying twice, because those are the two primary areas that the government makes money. Then the corporations got a little bit of income tax and miscellaneous. Let's go to the bills that the government pays. So expenses are broken down into two categories: direct or mandatory spending and discretionary spending. So the majority of the bills that the government pays, which is 59% in fiscal year 2025, are direct mandatory bills. Social Security, they pay over $1.5 trillion out to people in Social Security. I hope there's some left when I need Social Security. Then another trillion for other mandatory, such as Medicare, Medicaid. All of those are mandatory bills. So the majority of the revenue that comes in, 59% of that is paid out in direct mandatory bills. Then 27% is discretionary. That is where defense gets their budget, State Department, Department of Education. That 27% is broken down to everybody else to use. And then 14% is paid to the debt, paid on our debt, interest on the debt. So your discretionary budget, I think about half of it goes to defense. So of that 27%, 884 billion is defense, and non-defense with everybody else is taken to 995 billion. So don't really get caught up on the numbers. That's why I'm kind of glossing over them. Just understand that defense gets about half of the discretionary, almost half, and then all the other agencies now have to fight for that additional amount. So the financial management is linked, and the budget process is linked to plan, program, budget, and execution. That is how the DoD formulates their portion of the president's budget, by using PEEB. And we use the PALM process to develop the program requests. And then we use the budget estimate submission to develop our budget, to say, hey, what appropriations we need. So DoD uses PPBE to do that. because there's also a requirement for every agency to have a strategic plan in place. Every 4 years, they have to update it. So DoD's strategic plan is called the National Defense Strategy. And the National Defense Strategy, and you'll learn more about this in Module 2, comes from the Big Op orders, the National Security Strategy, and then the agencies develop their own. So DoD uses and develops the National Defense Strategy. So that satisfies the 4-year requirement for a strategic plan. And then once the president submits the budget to Congress, then Congress takes action on it. So there's a few things that they do, and you'll remember some of the terms from earlier. The first step is the concurrent budget resolution process. When they get the budget request from the president, Congress has to first know what guidelines they're going to use and what their agenda is going to be when they look at the PresBud. And so that is the concurrent budget resolution process. And so your CBO, Congressional Budget Office, they come up with all the numbers, historical data, the total budget outlay. Outlay is when you pay out the money. The deficit that we have, any surplus if we have, budget authority, how much we received last year. The CBO comes up with all of that data, presents it to the House and Senate Budget Committee. Then they come up with the guidelines. The congressional concurrent budget resolution happens in both sides, but it does not go to the president for the president to sign. The next step is the authorization process. The House and Senate Armed Services Committee is responsible for that process. And in the National Defense Authorization Bill, what it does, it authorizes programs, the category of things that the Department of Defense and the other agencies are allowed to do in that upcoming fiscal year. The authorization process ends by going to the president for the president to sign for it to become law. So the DoD has permanent authority to operate, but it must get this annual authorization of specific programs. If your authorization law talks about funding, it doesn't matter because it does not give us any budget authority, it doesn't give us any money. So if you're given a scenario and it says in the authorization law, they approved $5 million for construction, and in the appropriation law, you receive $0 for construction. How much funding do you have? You have zero because you receive your budget authority from the appropriation law, which is the third phase. So appropriation process occurs in the House and Senate Appropriations Committee. They approve the funding levels for each appropriation, the HAC and the SAC. So there are 12 subcommittees, which directly aligns with the 12 annual appropriations: agriculture, homeland, defense, security, commerce. Appropriation also ends by going to the president for the president to sign. Of the 12 appropriations that are out there are 3 that are specific to the Department of Defense that you need to know. There's the defense appropriation, military construction / Veterans Affairs, and the energy and water development appropriations. Those are the 3. Congress often places limits on the use of these funds. They can earmark funds sometimes. Even if the president asks for funding in construction, he might say not to you can do construction, but not to exceed $2 million. So that's a ceiling, or not less than. I want to make sure you spend money on construction. I can say not less than X amount of dollars, or fence it exclusively for. Another term you need to be familiar with: continuing resolution. That's that temporary appropriation law that Congress can put in place if they're not ready to enact a new appropriation law by 1 October. The guidelines under the CR is no new starts. Whatever you were operating, same rate of operations from the previous fiscal year. And so you should not be coming up with those new ideas, contract, when you're operating under a CR. Budget execution begins when Congress appropriates the funds. So once the Appropriation Act is in place, the president signs it, then that begins the budget execution phase. It provides budget authority, gives us money, and then you are limited by the earmarking and all those guidelines that the Congress has, and you're limited by the purpose, time, and amount of those appropriations. So two things happen when Congress appropriates the funds. The first one that's tied to law is the Treasury issues a Treasury warrant, because the Treasury also knows that they cannot issue any funding if they don't have an appropriation law in place. So once that appropriation law in place, the Treasury issues an appropriation or Treasury warrant, which is a Fiscal Service Form 6200, notifying the agencies that budget authority has been approved. So the issuance of the appropriation warrant is the first legal step, because this is the step that's tied to Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7, saying no money can be drawn out the Treasury. So that's a legal step. And then the second thing that happens is OMB begins the apportionment process. Now, what does that look like? Once Congress appropriates the funds, the agencies will fill out an SF-132 document requesting their funding or their apportionment. So DOD, and at the DOD, their budget person is the USD Comptroller. So the Undersecretary of Defense Comptroller will fill out an SF-132, say, okay, Congress appropriate defense budget for $2 million. Fill it out, 2 million on my SF-132. Doesn't mean you're going to get all two, but they fill it out. They submit it to OMB within 10 days of the appropriation being enacted. And then OMB has 30 days to issue the apportionment. OSD and the other agencies will then allot or allocate the funds to their subordinate organization on a funding authorization document or a FAD. And so those are the two steps. Treasury issuing Treasury warrant is a legal step, and OMB negotiates the apportionment with the agencies on the SF-132. All right, so if you know the flow of funds, Congress appropriates, OMB apportions, DOD issues allotment, we commit, administrative reservation of funds, obligate, legal reservation of funds, and we outlay funds. What we call disbursement, the proper term in the CDFM is outlay. When the funds are removed from the Treasury to liquidate an obligation, it is called outlay. So you need to know the flow of funds and the order in which they occur, because you're going to have some terms, and these were in the older study guides also. You'll find these terms: unapportioned appropriations, unallotted appropriations, unobligated allotments, unliquidated obligations, and expended appropriation. So let's go with the first one. If they give you dollar amounts and they say, what is the unapportioned appropriation? That means they're going to give you the dollar amount for the appropriation. They're going to give you a dollar amount for apportionment. And then they say, what is the unapportioned amounts? It just take subtracting what's already apportioned out of your appropriation. There's your answer. Okay, so let's not make it. So appropriate from Congress, OMB apportions on the SF-132, and DOD issues allotment. Commit, obligate, outlay. And then once you execute, you have to monitor. So we use administrative controls. We put controls in place, auditing controls, We put different steps in place, internal controls in place to monitor the use of those funds. We have planned versus actual in what we look at, how much we planned on spending, how much we receive, what we actually spend. We have to consistently assess those different results and see if we're actually spending the money in the order in which they were received, or the reason they were received. And then review is done of those funds. So DOD must report to OMB the status of those budget execution using an SF-133. So they got to do it quarterly. So SF-132 was a document for them to request the apportionment, and then quarterly, the OMB receives update from DOD to say, this is planned, this is what we spent, and this is what we spent it on. And then all at the same time, your congressional oversight is still there with the GAO, that independent auditing agency that's checks and balances to making sure that we're following the rules that were established by Congress in how we use those funding. The leader of the GAO's title is Comptroller General. So in the study guides, a lot of times you'll see CG listed here, there, CG. It is not Commanding General, it is Comptroller General, and that is the title of the individual in charge of the Government Accountability Office. They're the ones that provide oversight for Congress to make sure that we are following the rules that were laid out in the authorization law and in the appropriation law. All right, this concludes the review of CDFM Module 1, Competency 1, Government Resource Management Environment from the 2024 Participant Guide or Study Guide. And if you have not again already subscribed, please go ahead and subscribe to our YouTube page. And I also have the notes. I'll put the links to the notes. There'll be a minimal fee for the notes, because I do take, it's like 12 pages. I do take a lot of time going through these notes. And so you have, and you could pay more if you want to. That's up to you. So I'll provide that later. So this is Helen Thomas and the CDFM Study Group. I look forward to continuing working with you guys as you are striving to earn your CDFM designation. So let me go ahead. So this is Helen Thomas and the CDFM Study Group. I'll see you guys again next time.